Hi there, this is Iain, and I'm very pleased to bring you this special episode of the Ski Podcast. It's an interview with ski industry veteran Peter Hardy. Peter Hardy has been skiing for longer than most of us have been alive, and he knows everything about everything as far as the world of skiing is concerned. I talked to him about all sorts of things, including his first experiences on snow in Lech in the 1960s, but as varied as what it was like being accused of spying in Uganda and being a friend of Idi Amin in the 70s. Also trying old ski kit with Graham Bell, watching him skiing on skis from the 19th century, and going on tour with James Blunt. Peter is definitely a man who's lived a very, very interesting life, and I'm sure you will enjoy this podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Hardy, a ski industry veteran. He's an award-winning writer and acknowledged internationally as Britain's leading expert on the ski industry worldwide. He currently represents Val d'Isère in the UK. He's co-editor of We Love to Ski, and he is the co-presenter of the Action Packed podcast. Now, we'll come back to podcasting, but what I'd like to do today is to find out a little bit more about one of the longest and most illustrious careers in ski journalism in the UK. Good morning, Peter. How are you?
Morning. I'm fine. Nice to be on the show.
Well, it's nice to see you in person, because we're recording this on video, which is we've had so few kind of ski events, and we were discussing a little bit earlier about the frustrations of skiing this season. But I'd rather look on the positive today and find out a little bit more about your career, because what I mentioned earlier, you've been working in the industry for a long time, but I think you've been skiing for a long time. Can I ask you when you actually started skiing?
I almost daren't answer that. It's such a long time ago, long before anyone right here was born. I actually started when I was 12 years old, which takes me to 1960, the early winter of 1960. We went on a family holiday to Lech am Arlberg in Austria, and I put on skis for the first time. I have to say they were really big skis. I can remember it very well indeed, going into the shop, which is called Pfefferkorn, on the main street by the church in Lech. And the first thing you do is put your hand above your head, right above your head, to measure the length of the ski. So I was sort of gangly 12-year-old, I suppose, not particularly athletic, but like the idea of having a go at skiing. So you end up with this thing that is sort of 2 meters long, 2 meters 5, maybe 2 meters 10. I think 2 meters 5 would be good. And that is an enormous sort of plank of wood to try and put on your feet and make it go around corners. Well, it didn't, is the answer.
Right, and that was in Lech. So in Lech in 1960, I mean, was there much of a lift system there at that time?
Yeah, there was quite a good lift system, actually. Lech was one of the resorts after World War II that was a beneficiary of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And lots of money was pumped in. And the village fathers wisely thought to themselves, well, we've got to do something to make a living. Why don't we have a go at skiing? So they put in really quite a good infrastructure of lifts. There was a cable car and quite a lot of chair lifts. And the layout of the mountain was really very similar to what it is today. I mean, in that enormous period of time, Lech has changed a lot. And I go back there quite regularly. It's changed a lot, and at the same time, it hasn't changed, because it's still Lech and then Oberlech, the car-free village above it. These days, that's all linked by underground tunnels and things between the hotels. But in those days, obviously, there was nothing like that. But it was quite quiet. I mean, there weren't that many people there. Any other Brits in the resort, you knew them. You met them and you talked to them. I mean, there was that many.
That's great. Actually, I started skiing very near to there myself. I started in St Anton, not so much longer after that. And my parents, were one of the few Britons who used to go out St Anton in the 60s. And they told me about where they used to stay. And I tracked it down a few years ago and managed to meet. And that their family is called Falch. It's probably a name that you know in St Anton. It's seen all over St Anton. Yeah. And when they went there, Haus Falch, where they stayed, their instructor was a guy called Richard Falch. But he was an instructor, but he was also a farmer at the same time. And he had a herd of cows. And during the winter, the cows were in the ground floor underneath
the actual house, the pension where they lived, and that was effectively their central heating, the heat of all the cows coming up through the building. And that's how St Anton, for example, had changed. It used to be a very small farming community, and I'm guessing Lech had that kind of feel to it around that era as well.
Oh, very much so. I remember going to St Anton, not perhaps that year, but certainly in the following years, because we used to go every year to Lech. And it was the same sort of atmosphere. Obviously, St Anton's a bit bigger, but it was the same sort of thing. And of course, the two areas then were very separate ski areas. You couldn't ski between the two.
For sure. And I think another thing, when I learned to ski, we went out by car, but when my parents first went out to St Anton and to Obergurgl, which is where they met, they went out by train. And I've questioned my mum about this. She has no idea. I think it was probably Erna Low, but there was probably only Erna Low or Ingham's perhaps who were offering trips to St Anton around that time. Do you recall how you travelled out there at all?
Yeah, the first couple of years we travelled out by car. My dad was a very keen driver, and we used to go and stop on the way and make that part of the holiday as well. And then we did indeed go on the Erna Low charter train to Austria, and I can remember it distinctly. I suppose by then we're talking about 1963, something like that, and I can remember distinctly going on this train. As with everything of sort of Erna did like that, it was all sort of slightly thrown together at times. She did her best. You can imagine Erna, who was then a very small company, actually trying to do the fine details of a charter train that went the whole way across Europe to the stations at Langen, which is near the Arlberg Pass, and from there I don't know how we travelled on to Lech. I can't remember that bit. I'm a guess a car of some type, a taxi of some type. I do remember there were horse-drawn sleighs as well, but I think that was expensive, and we certainly didn't travel all the way up there in a sleigh across the Flexen Pass. But the train itself was a remarkable journey. The most important thing, as far as I remember, was that it was a hodgepodge of carriages put together, quite run-down carriages, they seemed to me. And there was a disco car. That was the real exciting thing. And the disco car, I can visualize it now. It had, of course, because there were no sort of gimbals to keep the thing straight, like the old trains, like you see a sort of movie of the Orient Express or something, you were bashed around as you moved down the corridor of the train. It was exactly the same thing inside the disco carriage. So anyone trying to dance was sort of falling into everybody else, not helped by gallons of double diamond would have been the beer, which people were consuming and spilling all over the floor. And the music was provided by a record player, a gramophone almost, a record player that was on. Well, that actually was on gimbals, and you could buy these things to go into cars. And my much older brother had one in his car. I remember, as one of these record players, where it was sort of mounted on springs, so that it kind of absorbed some of the shock of driving. And you whacked a 45 record, and anyone knows what that is, a 45 into the sort of slot, and away it went. But of course, the needle would sort of bounce around, and every time you hit a point on the charter train, it jumped enormously. So you sort of lost the rhythm. It all seemed quite fun.
Yeah, well, it definitely sounds like quite fun. I might just chip in at this point that as well as this special, that listener, if you're listening to this now, might be worth you digging out our ski special podcast special we did about Erna Low, where actually I interviewed Mark Frary, who I'm sure you know very well, Peter, about the book he wrote, Aiming High, about Erna Low, and that will give you a lot more insight into this pioneer of the ski industry. It's very, very interesting. Just to track back, Peter, to those early days of skiing then. I mean, these days people are used to wearing Gore-Tex and padded jackets and all sorts of stuff. You mentioned the skis and the equipment that you use. What kind of clothing or gloves, etc., were you equipped with at that time?
Well, we used to rent them. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to do looking at now. But we used to go to Lillywhite's when it was a big department store, a smart department store in central London. And we rented these for very low figures. You rented a jacket and a pair of ski trousers. The ski trousers was sort of kind of stretch tight trousers, which they seemed to fit quite well. And then the jacket, which was extremely lightweight. I remember the second year I had one by by Luther, a big brand, but that was in their infancy. And that was really smart, I felt. But then he just wore a very thick sweater or something underneath, and that was it. There was always a complete separation between your top of your body and the bottom of your body, which is great for skiing. But this was a bit more than that. It was the clothing separation. So you probably had a cold midriff.
That doesn't sound too good. Gloves, would they be leather gloves, I'm thinking?
No, there were some leather gloves, woolen gloves, mainly woolen gloves.
Yeah, that wouldn't be so good on a cold day, really, would it?
Oh, absolutely. When you were, as you were always falling over, you were in my case, then you were sort of soaked permanently from early in the morning until the afternoon, but you just sort of put up with it. And then the boots were, initially, the first year, the boots were lace-up boots, leather lace-up boots that didn't really cover the ankle, because you could actually break your ankle skiing in those days. That was the main injury.
Yeah.
Now the pain and the point of danger rises up the leg to the knee, but in those days it was very much the ankle that was at risk.
So those were your early days of skiing, and I think I'm right in saying that as you moved into your career, you started working as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent. Is that right?
Yeah, I was very much a general reporter to start with, and then later on a foreign correspondent. But I trained in the provinces, and then I got a job on the Evening Standard, and life went on from there, really. But I didn't do much skiing then because I was too busy traveling all over the place.
I guess you were. I tell me if this is correct. I read this somewhere. I read that in Idi Amin's Uganda, you escaped execution after receiving a death sentence for alleged spying. Is that true?
Yeah, it is. It's a long story, told too many times over the years. But yes, I was arrested for so-called spying. Obviously, I wasn't, and was sentenced to death, and managed to obviously talk my way out of it, because here I am today. It's a long tale, but I got to know Idi Amin very well. I went to sort of stay with him, and I was there for some weeks, staying in the State House in Tebbe, the palace, with him. And it's a long saga, but I was very lucky to get away with it. Yes.
Gosh, well, that's one for possibly a different podcast, but it sounds fascinating. But I think that you were a foreign correspondent, and then you came back to skiing again. Do you want to explain how that came about?
Yeah, I used to when I was probably about 30, just about coming up to 30. Somebody working by then on the Evening Standard, no, by then on the Daily Express, and I got the opportunity to go on a press trip with some other journalists, and off we went. And I thought, hey, this is pretty good fun. What have I been missing? By then, of course, skis and equipment were getting much easier to learn on, so you didn't spend your entire time lying on your bum. And I just quite slowly fell in love with the whole idea of it, and then realized in the end that's what I want to do the rest of my life. And I took a conscious decision then in 1984 to give up what I was doing and just go skiing.
That sounds like a decision that was probably one of the biggest and most important ones in your life. And I think that was also influenced by the fact that you'd met Felice, your wife, at some time around then.
Yeah. I'd met Felice, who was then the deputy editor of what was in those days Ski Survey, the ski club magazine, which became Ski and Board. And we sort of met, and we met in Austria, actually, in Obertang. And we decided that we'd have a life together. How would we earn a living? And I was still traveling around and wanted to stop. And she said, well, what can you do? Skiing, you love skiing. We can make a living out of skiing. And I said, don't be ridiculous. Nobody makes a living out of writing about skiing. But here we are, still doing it all these years later.
Well, that's very, very impressive. I think it's probably harder to make a living out of writing now, with publications, etc., fewer publications being around. But during the course of your career, I think you've written for most, if not all, of the key ski publications. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think I've written for every every national newspaper just about.
When you decided to become a ski journalist on a full-time basis, I think it coincided with a boom in skiing through the 80s with big chalet operators like Bladen Lines and Super Travel and Mark Warner all just starting up. And at that time, I think you were writing a weekly column in the Telegraph. Is that right?
Yeah, I wrote a weekly column in the Telegraph for a very long time, actually. I started there in 1990, 1991, one or the other. And I did it really until gradually less over the years, but right up until about 10 years ago, I was doing it on a weekly basis.
And did you always find enough things to be able to write about? Or did it just give you an excuse to visit many resorts?
Well, there was always an excuse to go to another resort. No, I never had a problem. I've never had a problem finding things to write about. And I just decided each week where I would go and what I would do. It was, looking back on it now, it was a fabulous opportunity. And I would just sort of go and produce the column, and as long as it was on time and appeared, everyone was very happy about it.
Excellent. And how many resorts do you think that you've been to over your career then?
Well, I'm not like Arnie Wilson, who's sort of collected more than anyone else alive, I think. He's up in the 700 somewhere, but I passed the 500 mark. I don't really sort of count it. He and I have arguments about what is a resort. Does it have to have its own lift map to be a resort, or can it be some tiny village off the edge of it that calls itself a ski resort that's linked into the main area? So it's a pretty grey area, but I've been to a lot of resorts, yeah.
Right, over 500 is pretty good for sure. I mean, that's an interesting kind of philosophical question you bring up there. What is a ski resort? If there's snow there and you ski on it, does that make it a ski resort? Does it have to have a lift?
When Arnie read his book about going around the world, you know, he skied every day for a year, and sometimes they just had to ski on a little patch of snow somewhere on the side of a motorway. It's very hard to define what is an actual ski resort.
So as well as writing for the Telegraph and visiting all of these different resorts, you've built up a vast amount of knowledge of the different resorts, and that led to you've written a few books, I think, including the Good Skiing and Snowboard Guide, which was then subsequently renamed the Hardy Skiing and Snowboard Guide.
Yeah, we did that for many years. First, we took it over because it already was up and running. When we took it over in 1984, I think, 85, and it was a question. It wasn't a question of just re-editing it every year. It was a question of rewriting it every year. So it was an enormous task because it took us from January until May, which is when it came out. We never really saw daylight really during we kept going skiing to the end of the season, but then it was just about 6 weeks or 2 months of just working 20 hours a day to try and get this book out of the way. But it was really good. It was a really good experience. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And then it changed publishers, which gave it up. And then we went to another publisher, and it became Hardy Skiing and Snowboarding Guide in the end. Then we decided one day, what are we going to do with this? I felt that the end of ski guidebooks had arrived. The world was changing. And we then just met up with Sean Newsom, ski editor of the Sunday Times, and he just started, was in the process of starting this website, weloveToski.com, and we got talking, and we thought, well, why not? And he thought, why not? Let's use the guide as a basis for the content of the website, and that's how We Love to Ski started, really.
Yeah, that makes it. I mean, what you're describing there is for younger listeners, the idea that there was a time pre-internet when the only way you could get your information about ski resorts was to buy yourself a book. I remember, when we had a holiday coming up, we do a bit of research and find out about it. From one of these books which had all the information, what the best runs were and how many lifts there were, etc., and how many pieces. Whereas now it's almost hard to imagine that you can just go to a site like We Love to Ski and find that information straight away. Everybody assumes that, but you forget at the time to research it all, as you're talking about, was a process that took months, and obviously it would change every year. And you couldn't just update a page on the internet. You're talking about a whole new publication.
Absolutely. It was extraordinary looking back, because I would go to resorts sometimes, and in a mountain restaurant, you see someone poring over a copy of our book, deciding where they were going to go next. Where it's not exactly like looking at a screen, is it?
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
The book was quite heavy to carry around.
A documentary about skiing with Graham Bell, where you were using some of that equipment that you've used when you a child yourself. Was that quite weird going back to that again?
Well, I went to a lot earlier skis than that because I've got a little collection of skis and I borrowed a few others of other people. So the idea was to take skis from 1890, which was even before my time, from 1890, and right up until the 60s in 10-year periods, and see how skiing had progressed and changed over that period. So when we got to Cervinia, which is where we did it in summer, we had all the right clothing, Graham and I. We were dressed up in Sherlock Holmes type clothing, and the producer of the movie said to me, "Look, Peter, what we really want is for Graham to fall over, arse over. We really want him to fall over in the middle of all this. So your job now is to find him the oldest and most difficult skis you can find, and some really uncomfortable boots." So I rose to the occasion, and I gave him a pair of, which I own, a pair of 1890 skis. They are enormous planks. I've never actually measured how long, but they're certainly they're certainly pushing towards 220, I should think. And they're wide, and there's no side cut. What's a side cut?
Yeah.
And the binding is a piece of metal that's been made in the local blacksmith shop as a sort of toe piece, and this comes around to a strap at the back, a telemark strap, if you like, but it was pretty early telemark, which was, in this case, the leather on that was pretty hard nail, as you can imagine. They've been sitting in a house with central heating for the last 50 years or something. So I softened up the leather a bit anyway, and gave him these. He looked a bit taken aback, Graham, when he looked at these. And the boots were a pair of boots that you would have worn on a farm in 1890, 1900, maybe they're a little bit later, but they were just hobnail boots. And they've been converted by someone so that the toe piece was cut straight along the top, and it would fit into this piece of metal, just about. And there was a groove, a handmade groove in the back, which held the strap in place, just about. So Graham looked at these, sort of, looking slightly sort of strange. I chose myself a pair of 1960 skis, about the ones, head metal skis, about the ones where I came in on, just about, and a pair of really horrible boots. They were the first clip boots. That when you went up a T-bar, the clips used to join onto your neighbour's boot, which made it
difficult. I remember that.
And so I got these on my feet, and up the glacier we went. We got to the top, and we got out, and I put mine on, and Graham put his on, and he just skied off. He just skied off like he'd been doing it all his life. He can telemark, which I can't, which I have to say is a huge advantage. But it was remarkable. It just looked graceful and beautiful, and the turns were inevitably very slow because that thing took a long time to get around the corner. But he was great with it, and he really just enjoyed it. And I thought, well, they're going with it too. So I went on, and I put my skis on. Now, when you're skiing, you do something, somewhere up in your head, your brain says, it's time for a turn, Peter. So that signal then slowly goes down from your head, down to your ankles, and you turn. Well, in this case, the signal went from my brain, it got to about my knee, and then no further, nothing happened at all. It couldn't go round. Because of course, you have to ski, if you're thinking with a fixed binding, as I was, in a very different style to what we ski today. To make this, and the ski did 100. You had to do 100% of the work. The ski didn't do anything much unless you told it to. Whereas now, skis just ski on their own to a degree. Anyway, we did the filming, and at the end of the day, in 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were right up the top on the glacier, obviously, and that was the only station open. But Graham decided he would ski down the closed glacier down to the mid station where the lift did actually stop, so he could get on there. And he and the cameraman, who was a really good skier, but he was on today's skis, off they went down the glacier, and we just watched out of the window as we came down the lift, and he just skied beautifully all the way down. I mean, remarkable. That's the true mark of a good skier. I wish I could ski like that.
Well, when you've been to 5 Winter Olympics, maybe that gives you the pedigree to be able to do that sort of thing. And in terms of publications, you've produced a number of books over your career, but I was interested that there was a sort of a diversification into a different area with a book which I think the title is called "Different Country, Same State," where you followed James Blunt the singer, on his global tour, I think. And I wondered whether, because I know that he's very keen on Verbier, and maybe he might live in Verbier, he certainly has a residence there. Is that how you came into contact with James Blunt? How did that work out?
Yeah, this was my kind of midlife crisis, I guess, to go off and write this book about James. I'd actually known him for since he was a young teenager, because his mum used to work for us, and we had a photo library at the time, and she used to run the photo library for us, and we became great family friends. So I got to know James, and as he said, I saw him go through university and then into the army, and we spent a Christmas together once. I've sung the 12 Days of Christmas with him. My one claim to fame as a singer, I can tell you. And we, as I say, are great family friends. And then I put the idea to him that when he became famous, perhaps it would be a good idea to have me along to be a fly on the wall while he was on tour. And he thought the idea was absolutely ridiculous. A guy who's the age of his father doing this, and indeed, twice the age at least of all the band, and it wouldn't work at all. But I convinced him that we should sort of have a little go at this, and I used to turn up in different places for the first sort of few weeks, and then he thought, well, hang on, this is such a ridiculous idea, but maybe it's a really good one. So it took me a little while to be promoted to the level at which I could travel on the tour bus with them. But gradually they realized that actually I've had a long and varied life, and I've seen it all and got the T-shirt. And I was non-judgmental on anything that they might do, or indeed I might do. And we had a tremendous time. I think I can't remember how many gigs I went to, but it's many hundreds. And we went all over the world with them. And because of my job, I could sort of just turn up somewhere. So they were in Australia, and they didn't think it sort of strange that they were having a drink in a bar one evening, and I just walked in. I mean, James knew I was coming, but he never told anyone. And they'd say, "Oh, hello, Peter. What are you doing here?" And we just carried on I'd stay there for a week or two and travel with them and get a bit more detail on what was going on, and then go away again. So I, on and off for about 4 years, I went on tour with them.
Great. And then the book was published in 2009 or something like that?
2009, yeah.
And that just is the backstage story of his tour, is it?
Yeah, it's the backstage story. It's the book. What goes on tour should stay on tour. This didn't. I have to say that James had the part of the deal was that he could change anything he wanted, or he had overall rights for it. And every time I took out something because I thought it was a bit dodgy, he said, "No, we want more detail on that." So it was it was quite tricky when we got to the level of when you write a book, you then have to be checked by libel lawyers, and the libel lawyer was a slightly prim lady, and she came back with 276 cases of potential libel in the book. The publishers threw their hands in despair. I said, no, just go through them one by one, and I did. And she kept coming back to me saying, "Well, if you're saying this, it means that so and so was under the influence of drugs, and that you were drunk." And I said, yeah, that's right. And when the book is published, he's going to deny that, and we're going to be sued for millions. No, I'll get an affidavit from him now saying that's what happened.
That's really interesting to hear. I know that James, from, I don't know him personally, but from what he's posted and shared on Twitter before, has a pretty good sense of humor and is quite self-effacing. So it doesn't come across as a surprise to hear that he's happy to be open about all of those things in a book. Yeah,
he has a very, very fine sense of humor, and he's a very fine skier too, which is really brings us on to that. And he's got a house in Verbier, and he has a lift named after him in Verbier.
Right.
I was a bit instrumental in bringing around because I was talking to the authorities in Verbier, and they were looking for a new person to sponsor. They have godfathers and godmothers for the lift, and I suggested him, and then that's how it came about. So we went there and we had a sort of big lift opening ceremony and things. It was all good fun, and he's a good skier. He did downhill in the army ski team and things, so he knows exactly what he's doing.
Excellent. Well, I'm gonna have to track down that book as well. So clearly you've had an extremely varied career, and more recently you've kind of gone off also into another direction. I mean, bringing together all of your experience from travel, but with Felice, you've set up and launched the Action Pack podcast.
It's called Action Pack Travel. Launched this on March the 13th, Friday, March the 13th, 2020, which, if you think about it, was probably one of the worst dates in history for starting a new business. This was the week when skiing collapsed. It stopped. All the lifts started closing. We thought it was just temporary, but look, here we are now. And we thought we could see, therefore, that the making a living out of skiing was going to be, at least temporarily, not possible. So we thought, what should we do, and what should we do to fill our time? So we started, or we'd had the idea for some time, but we actually got on with starting a podcast. And as you know, that's not quite as easy as it sounds, is it? There's a lot of work goes into this.
That is certainly true. It's interesting the date you mentioned there, because I know exactly where I was, because I was traveling on a train between Arosa and Andermatt at the time when I was looking at my phone and discovered the lifts in Switzerland were going to close the following day. As it was, we were able to go ski touring for a couple of days in Andermatt afterwards, but I know that date. And in relation to podcasting, I think before I started producing podcasts and I listened to them, I'd never really considered the amount of work that goes into it, particularly if you are your own editor and producer and researcher, etc. as well. Well, I haven't listened to all of your podcasts, but I've listened to quite a lot of them, and they're very varied. You cover all sorts of different subjects. I wondered how you choose your subjects.
Well, obviously skiing to start with was our main subject in lots of ways, but both of us have done a lot of other travel writing as well. So we know a lot of people, and a lot of people around the world. And to start with, it was just finding friends to do it and come on and talk, because we had to start with Zoom. And for a while, we were able in the autumn to get out and go and meet people and do live broadcasts. But now we're back on Zoom again. But it's been a question each week. We do it every week. We're on episode 46 now, I think. And that's a lot of work trying to find the people. People say to me, have you got a list of sort of 4 or 5 weeks in advance? No, 4 or 5 days in advance. And then sometimes you get a glut, and you've got, right at this minute, I've got 3 in the can, which is wonderful. And you can sort of relax a bit. But most of the time, it's a scrabble to find the people, get the people to do it, research them, and do the show. But it's good fun. It's a really interesting thing. And we try to be as varied as possible. So we've done everything from polar explorers and safaris and all sorts of things.
Well, I can certainly recommend it, Action Pack Travel. I've listened to a number of them. My favourite was the one set in Bath, which I'm guessing, well, it was recorded on location, wasn't it? And it gave it that extra sense that I really enjoy, the feeling of being there.
Well, it's one of those few that we've actually been able to get out and do. And that was great, because Bath laid it on for us, and we had a tour by candlelight of the baths, of the Roman baths, and it was really good to do. We did Stonehenge as well. That was fun. And Wookey Hole at Halloween. That was probably my favourite in lots of ways. We had this guy took us around speaking in a very voice. I didn't know, we get witch lives down here. And we sort of clomped through all these caverns. It was good fun.
You mentioned that with the podcast, you get to explore your own interests and you get to meet interesting people. And I think really that's what I've enjoyed about the podcasting that I've been doing as well. And I've really enjoyed being able to chat with you today, Peter. I know we meet at different events, but there's not always time to find out about your very interesting career. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. And I look forward to listening to more of your podcasts in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed it.
Hi there, listener. Iain here. I just wanted to let you know that you can now support the Ski Podcast at buymeacoffee.com. Researching, recording, editing and publishing the pod takes up a lot of my time. And don't get me wrong, I really enjoy it. I love talking with people about skiing. But if you do enjoy listening to the podcast and you'd like to support us, then you can literally buy me a coffee, or in my case it would be a cup of tea, but the idea is the same. So just go to buymeacoffee.com/the Ski Podcast. Thanks very much.